just in a bubble of theory, it's actually in a practice that leaves the world a better place. Well, while we're on D's, disaster, design and development, let me start with another D, the deceptions. The new craze in tourism is slum-themed holidays. Yes, now you can live just like the millions who live in shanty shacks, with a few luxury features thrown in, of course. One South African country charges rich tourists $82 a night. That's about half the average South African's monthly salary, just for a night's stay at a slum near Bloemfontein, South Africa. And it boasts that it's the only slum in the world equipped with underfloor heating and wireless internet access. The company has thought of everything. Battery-operated radio, outdoor toilets, even a big old drum to cook your dinner in. Everything that is, according to the company, normally part of the slum lifestyle. And all, to add to their brochure, within the safe environment of a private game reserve. The company's press release states, "The shanty town is ideal for team building, bachelor parties, fancy theme parties, and the experience of a lifetime. It accommodates up to 52 guests, and our shanties are completely safe and child-friendly." So, you can visit a shanty and perhaps ignore the fact while you're there having an authentic experience that 1 in 9 people in South Africa are infected with HIV, that nearly 30% are unemployed, that nearly 3 million children, that's 4% of the population, are orphans, but you can still live just like the poor. And you can do that in India, Johannesburg, Rio de Janeiro. Well, I hope you learn in this Master of Design, Disaster and Development, I'm just going to call it MoD, that's simpler, that you're not just like the poor. That knowing who you are, maintaining perspective, being able to sniff bull a mile off is pretty important in terms of being realistic. You won't have to live like, if you're in one of these shanty experiences, real poverty, you won't have to experience it living without clean water, without enough food, with the violence, rampant crime and disease. We have to acknowledge, to be honest, if we're going to be helpers without unintended consequences of disempowering people, that we are the first generation to experience the world secondhand through a host of devices that claim to give us real experiences, but they don't. It's why some people call this sort of thing poverty porn. But the intention, at least, is honourable. We do want to try and get out of our bubble, we all live in a bubble, and walk in the shoes of another, and that intention is honourable. But 99% of what happens in the world, we still have to acknowledge, given the bubble we're in, doesn't get mentioned in the media. The conflicts in Congo and Somalia, the earthquake in Tanzania, the plight of refugees offshore, gets far less space in our newspapers or our TV and iPhone screens than the breakup of Brad and Angelina. It's why our social media, our bubble, is so often a weapon of mass distraction. We live in the era of over-information. Over-information's not the same as good information. We often still believe in this nation that we can avoid the world's problems by isolating ourselves. We've had a Prime Minister in New York at the UN really lecturing the world that we have solved the refugee problem with our harsh borders. I noticed Malcolm didn't mention the uniqueness that we are the only nation continent on Earth with a massive sea around us. And this geographical phenomenon of uniqueness sort of makes the lecturing that we have got it right, given that everyone else has shared borders and land masses, is a little bit hollow, a little bit shallow, a little bit ridiculous. We can turn back the boats and stop the boats and put people in warehouse solutions in Manus and Nauru, indefinite detention, which is psychological torture. The uncertainty it breeds is psychological torture. And then we can go on the world stage and lecture the world that we have the solution. Well, we keep kidding ourselves in this nation without understanding our geographical and historical benefits, island continents surrounded by a natural barrier called ocean, that somehow the problems can be isolated. You know, I know, too few Australians know, that the world is a waterbed. You press down in one place, it comes up in another. If we lose the forests in Indonesia and Brazil, the impact in climate change can't mean we pull up a drawbridge as an island continent and say we're immune. We know that a few banks get into trouble, first in Britain and then it's America, and suddenly banks around the world are in financial trouble. The world is a waterbed. When swine flu broke out first in Mexico, about 2008, we were closing primary schools here in Melbourne, in inner city Melbourne, in Fitzroy. Whether it's global climate change, epidemics, whether it's financial distortions, the world is a waterbed. Yet Australians still want to think of ourselves as somehow able to isolate, just like our quarantine and customs and entry and exit, that the rest of the world's infected and we can stop the infections and we'll be okay. Well, when you start, as I'm sure you do in this course, to realise you can't quarantine yourselves from disruptive global forces, from refugees, asylum seekers, terrorism, from uncomfortable ideas and ideologies that feed it, from thinking that somehow we can avoid the shift to a low carbon economy because we got a lot of coal and it's cheap and it fuels a whole lot of the lifestyle that we like. When you start to realise that, you are getting out of your bubble. You're saying, I'm a global citizen first. My primary loyalty to being a citizen with national loyalty to Australia and Australia first. Actually, it's very short-sighted. This is a dead end. And I'm sure in this course you think about these issues. I say that because the latest Ipsos Global World Affairs poll found that nearly 8 in 10, 79% of Australian respondents agree that given the difficult economic issues in this country today, Australia has to focus less on the world and more on home. Those 8 out of 10 are self-delusional. It's that sort of poll that can lead our government under Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey to slash our aid budget to its lowest level ever in our history. There's Britain, Scandinavian, Dutch countries legislating 0.7% of aid in gross national income, 70 cents and $100, our promise to the world's poor. We're now at 21 cents. David Cameron, a Conservative Prime Minister, when under pressure said we won't balance the books in Britain on the backs of the poor. And he legislated 0.7%. We only ever got to 34 cents under Kevin Rudd, who actually did believe in this. We've now gone down to 21 cents. And do Australians care? Have you heard any protest? Have you heard outrage about breaching our solidarity with the world's poorest? No. As the Ipsos poll says, we just got to look after ourselves. As if you can be an island nation and aid is the only mechanism we had to deal with 65 million displaced people who will be coming our way with climate change, with the intractable issues of poverty, but we've slashed them. The reality is that about 800 million people on our planet live in extreme poverty. They go to bed hungry every night. It's why the 40-hour famine that World Vision's been running now 41 years is still powerful. You know, ice bucket challenges come and go, and different causes come and go. For 41 years, the biggest youth movement in Australia still has been the 40-hour famine. How many here ever did the 40-hour famine? A lot of you, look at it. Why does it work? Because for 40 hours, you get out of the bubble where you say, there's always money in my wallet to go to Macca's, there's always food in the fridge, this is my norm, and you feel in your body hunger pangs that 800 million feel each night. And you understand when you feel it in your body in a way the head never understands. It's just a concept that people are hungry. By actually living with hunger pangs, or whatever it is now that you deny yourself, there's a sense of learning that's deeper. You know, the heart always sees and understands well before the head sees and understands. That sense of the heart experiencing, being immersed in something, being embodied in something, like hunger pangs, that 800 million tonight feel, is quite powerful. Well, global emissions of carbon dioxide have increased over 50% since 1990. Water scarcity now affects 40% of people in the world. It's projected to increase. Without doubt, I still believe the greatest moral issue of justice is why today 16,000 children in our world under the age of 5 died from preventable causes. Not having enough food, dirty water, not having access to medicines you and I take for granted. 16,000 died today. Lest I'm sounding all too negative, when I started at World Vision just 13 years ago, it was 30,000 children under the age of 5 that died every day. When people say aid doesn't make a difference, we're not actually, the money doesn't get there, it's all lost on admin, you'll hear this, it's really a leave pass Australians like to give themselves. The figure has dropped from 30,000 to 16,000. Sure, some of that has been trade, India and China lifting people out of poverty. But when you look at the dramatic figures, it includes landlocked African countries with no resources, often with nasty neighbours, where because of aid, their children have stopped dying in the 13 years I've been at World Vision. Not all World Vision's work, I'm saying, but this global effort of Millennium Development Goals. And when Australians love to give themselves a leave pass, well, people in Africa, Asia, they're used to poverty, they're used to kids dying, it's not such a shock for them. Let me say straight out, a mother in Africa and Asia that loses a child experiences exactly the same pain as a mother that loses a child here in Australia. I know, I've seen it, I've been there. There is leave passes Australians want to give themselves because of the pathetic political leadership we've had. You know, we've just got to look after ourselves, budget emergencies. Britain, its public debt is 85% government debt of GNI, and they've legislated 0.7. Australia's public debt is 18%, and we've smashed aid. We love giving ourselves a leave pass in this country. We love finding excuses like, let's just look after our own. Poverty, charity begins at home. If I had $1 for every time I've heard that, I'd be a millionaire. Funnily enough, I've discovered most of the people who say charity begins at home and say it loudest and longest almost always are those who are doing least at home. It's interesting, this. Charity begins at home. I worked for 20 years running charities here in Australia before I went to World Vision. I believe in caring for our poor at home. What I profoundly dislike is how we set the poor here against the poor in absolute poverty overseas. We don't set the poor here against the defence budget spending or the extraordinary, unfair superannuation provisions for our rich. We don't set the poor here, let alone the poor overseas, against negative gearing here. Have you noticed anyone trying to set that up? Well, we love setting up the poor here against the poor overseas. Oh, we can't look after them. Charity begins at home. I'm picking up a little bit impatient with this narrative. Well, we may accept some of this suffering, 16,000 kids still dying a day, even though we're making progress as inevitable. But for the first time in history, we have the information, technology and resources to do something about poverty and injustice. We are making progress. Emergencies can't be eliminated, but we now know that their negative effects can be substantially mitigated. Increasing resilience and disaster preparation. Really simple things like mangrove swamps when tsunamis and waves flow through. We know that in areas prone to earthquakes, floods and other forms of natural disaster, $1 spent in prevention, mitigation beforehand, is worth $7 responding to the disaster. Disaster preparedness works. There's no argument anymore about the economic case for it. Well, let me talk, after talking about the deception, about the humanitarian vocational calling. I believe in humanitarian aid that it's not a job, it's a calling, a vocation. Voca is the Latin word for calling. We get a vocation when we have a calling. I meet many people frustrated in their jobs, doesn't seem to be giving them fulfilment and the purpose they wish for in life. And I actually see my staff at World Vision, as true at Oxfam and Carr and other organisations, staff where people have jobs that aligns with their values, where they know that whatever they're working on, whether overseas or at home, as architects, lawyers, engineers, strategists, design professionals, they do have opportunities to make a real difference. The work can be pedestrian, but it can also be challenging and rewarding. Some days, not every day, but some days you walk away at the end of a day's work with the feeling the world may be a better place because of the job you did that day. That is the calling part of it. That is that intersection between your happiness and the world's need. Being part of this community of people who share similar values and aspirations is hard to quantify, but it's profoundly important. People at World Vision, and this is unusual for most CEOs, don't queue up outside my office asking for a pay rise. Where in life do you get people working like that? There is a meaning quotient to their work. And we also are in a changing landscape. Relief and development work is happening in very challenging and changing locations of the world. The great advance we've had, 30,000 kids dying a day to 16,000, has largely been in poor but stable places. The challenge for us is poverty is retreating to conflict zones, to what we call fragile states, South Sudan and Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, to Congo. It's very difficult where there is conflict to actually do development, because development assumes long-term relational, not just hardware, the education and the housing and the health centres, but software, staying long enough to challenge culture and behaviours. The attitude of men who don't value their daughter's education and pull them out of school, marry them off to a bloke who's 20, 30 years older because they'll get a couple of cows for their 14-year-old daughter. He already has a few wives. In his mind, and this is the software you have to challenge, why would he pay for his daughter's education? If she gets a good education and a job, she will only bring benefit to the family she marries into, not to his. Challenging that software takes time. It takes relationship. It takes the ability to stay and do the software challenge of how you think about women, how you think about disease, how you think about even food. I have been in disaster situations where children are dying from malnutrition and there's food there. And when I ask people why their children are dying, they'll say no food. I'll say, but there are banana roots and there are, oh no, for generations our families haven't eaten those things. Our culture says we don't eat that. Well, actually, your children are dying. It raises profound questions about what right do we have to challenge culture. I'm open to exploring that with you, but we plant our feet pretty solidly on saying patriarchy that devalues girls and women may be your culture, but sorry, when it comes to development, it's not on with us. We regard your culture as challengeable because we believe in the intrinsic worth of girls. That's open, transparent. We're going to challenge the culture. We regard your children's lives as so important that eating foods your culture says we won't eat is not worth being silent about the cultural challenge here. That takes relationship. You don't do that just by wandering in and lecturing and pointing the finger. Good development builds relationship. Fragile states, conflict zones, it's very hard to build relationship. You don't have the time. It's too arbitrary, it's too difficult. This is where poverty is retreating, and it's a changing landscape that we are thinking hard about how we do good development in those situations. You certainly need resilience and compassion for others. You need lots of patience. You have to be sensitive to cross-cultural issues. There's no good challenging before there's a relationship there. I would say that in Indigenous Australia too. So much of our difficulty is a rotating door of relationships. Up in Jigalong, where we've been invited to work, 350 people in the community. Jigalong's famous for rabbit-proof fence. And I counted 84 different organisations working in Jigalong. People who come, fly in, always want to consult. No wonder Indigenous people, when they hear a Land Rover driving into Jigalong, decide to go fishing or hunting. Another set of relationships. They're going to stay a couple of years. They're not going to learn the language. Why would you bother? Our model at World Vision is to say 15 years. To say, you know, we will leave. You know, the money will stop. We're not creating dependency, but we'll be here for 15 years. Local people sharing your life, living as you live. Only in relationship can you then challenge people about their domestic violence, their drinking, their attitudes to women. Development is software as much as it is any hardware. Well, our learning never stops. It's easy to become jaded and complacent, but we are seeing progress, and that light on the hill keeps us committed. Well, when it comes to man-made disasters and natural disasters, we know that disaster strikes the poorest the hardest. Almost by definition, disaster hits those who are least prepared, most vulnerable, with the least resources. And for us, positioning ourselves with those people, experiencing their vulnerability, addressing their sense that no one actually cares is incredibly important. Let me talk about the tsunami. My first major disaster, I'd been in Darfur, Sudan before this, but my first major natural disaster was the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. It presented unprecedented logistical challenges. We have three categories of disaster cover. Category 3 is disasters affecting 1 million people or more across a wide geographic area. The Indian Ocean tsunami was like 5 simultaneous Category 3 disasters for us. Absolutely massive. Our global rapid response team were in the disaster areas in 24 hours. We can cope with 3 Category 3 global disasters simultaneously at any time. That's the capacity we have. Massive warehouses that are stationed from Cairns to Italy to Asia to be able to respond. Rapid response teams in World Vision circles are often known as the cowboys or the thunderbirds. It's quite a different mindset for disaster humanitarian relief than for development. Cowboys, thunderbirds, because the aim is to get in there quick, to save lives, to do what's necessary to stop the spread of disease. You don't care about rules and bureaucracy. It's time sensitive. And it's a particular sort of person. When you've done the disaster relief bit, food, clean water, shelter, hygiene products, prayer mats in Indonesia and Banda Aceh, flown in from our warehouses around the world, protecting children, those who are vulnerable, setting up child-friendly spaces. The disaster always leaves children who are the most marginal, the most vulnerable. Can't find their families, systems, communications broken down, the opportunity, even in disaster, for abuse, pedophiles. It sets up, that chaos sets up the opportunities for the worst of human nature. In that disaster, World Vision mounted 32 airlifts to Aceh in Sri Lanka in the first 2 weeks after the big waves hit. We reached 150,000 people in Banda Aceh, 70,000 in Sri Lanka, just to secure life and clean water and food. But at some point you need to withdraw the cowboys, the thunderbirds, because they're not terribly culturally sensitive. They're not wired that way. And the next phase is to actually go, now that we've secured life, how do you have people who are relational and development experts? It helped us in that disaster that we're already working among the poorest communities and we're trusted. And that next stage of development with local communities is assessing how they now want to proceed. When you're facing something like a tsunami, all land titles in Banda Aceh were destroyed. It happened also in Sri Lanka. So when the pressure from the Australian government and Australian donors is just rebuild the houses, and you're going with development experts, no. You rebuild a house that's on someone else's land. You are setting up conflict that can go for generations. Secondly, just rebuild it and do it quickly. Well, hang on. There's a whole heap of traumatised people here, those who've survived, who are not sure they want their house close to the sea again. They're not sure they can actually trust the ocean again. We have to take time and work with them until they're ready, and they're naming their readiness, putting up emergency places further inland until, where then we work with surviving elders to actually walk out slow labyrinth of work where they thought land titles were, and to give a stamp of approval because they're all destroyed, to mitigate the conflict and competition that might happen if we don't do that properly. So holding back donors, expectations, just do it, show us the pictures, and taking a development approach of saying when you're ready, when your land title has been cleared, is a really difficult situation. Explaining this between donors who poured out money and just want to see the pictures, and good design and proper community design is incredibly difficult. So many people, victims of the tsunami, said to me, I can't even trust the ground I'm standing on. I can't trust the sea where I made my livelihood as a fisherman. I'm not ready to rebuild a house. How do you communicate this to donors who just want the picture that their money has got them? The other reality was working with the government in Jakarta on new anti-earthquake legislation, new specified building standards, building better, building back better. An oft-used phrase, but really important. We know how to do it, but we need the will, the time, the understanding to actually have that space to do it. We only had to rebuild 2 houses out of 4,000 houses, 150 clinics and 200 high schools. That legislation was actually, we work with the government in Jakarta, passed for building back better. That allowed us time to do it. But in the meantime, the media clobbered us. They kept saying, show us the pictures, show us what you've done. As we said, hang on, this has got to be done right. People have survived, they're going to live, but they're not yet ready. Of course, in Indonesia, we feared that the money pledged for Aceh's reconstruction would end up in the pockets of Indonesian generals. There was this great political leader in Indonesia, Pak Kintoro. He was known as the anti-corruption czar. He was put in charge of Banda Aceh. And I remember he was addressing, we had about 600 staff, World Vision staff, our staff there in Banda Aceh. And he said, there will be no corruption. I'm here, there will be no corruption. Remember our staff, he was speaking Bahasa, Indonesian, and I was hearing a translation. When he said there will be no corruption, our staff, falling about laughing as if he was Woody Allen or Mick Dundee, they thought it was hilarious. In Indonesia, no corruption. But this Pak Kintoro was unlike any other leader I have seen. He was true to his word. Banda Aceh was a model case of donated money being used without corruption to build entire towns, new homes, schools and hospitals. When PricewaterhouseCoopers audited our books, and we do that with them every year, we knew corruption didn't happen, first in Indonesia. I returned in 2014 to Aceh. I just couldn't recognise where I'd been. Built back better. Quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. It was disorienting for me to see just how well this had been done and telling me that this is possible. Children playing in the street, businesses flourishing, hustle and bustle of commerce, beautiful houses, quite amazing. Well, let me pull this to a close by saying humanitarian aid work is not for amateurs, it's serious work. Lives are at risk, it requires phased skills for thunderbirds, cowboys, and withdrawing them at the right time with relational development workers. All agencies like us have a need for people, not just on the front lines, but in all areas of expertise. That's why I think MoDDD is such a vitally important course for us and for other agencies. Whatever your field of expertise, you can play a part in changing the world for better. You know, I know, we are part of a shared society. Peter Singer, in a wonderful book, The Life You Can Save, says all of us would act to save the life of someone who is in an immediate neighbour in danger. He then asks a very simple question. So if we do that automatically for someone whose life was at risk here in Australia, one of our neighbours, why is there an ethical difference if you can save the life of someone who's a distant neighbour? It's a very important question. The ethic of proximity says a particular responsibility to my immediate neighbour. He unpacks that ethic. And it's an ethic that the world has to discover if we are to solve our collective global challenges. Nationalism and xenophobia and building walls and retreat simply cannot do it in a global world. So, in discovering your true calling, your sense of vocation, you need to serve an idea greater than your own self-interest. Scientists tell us that two people sitting in the same room together exchange water vapour within 30 minutes. And they theorise that every square hectare of the Earth contains particles from every other square hectare. The astrophysicist, cosmologist Brian Swim has the view that whenever we take a deep breath, we breathe in some of the breath that Jesus exhaled on the cross. And he died 2,000 years ago. What science has discovered is a profound interconnection. We are embedded in one amazing web. The reality is profound interdependence, not individualism, not pull up the drawbridge and we'll be right. Martin Luther King, one of my heroes, said, in a real sense, all of life is interrelated. All persons are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are all links in the great chain of humanity. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. King said life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? So much of what you study can and will serve humanity, but only if you're clear about what is unchanging. What are the bedrock things you plant your feet on? Solid ground you occupy. That's why a vocation is important. It's asking the question, why am I here? What is this all about? How do I live authentically in an interconnected world? It's the advice of ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates and Aristotle. They said a virtuous life is a happy life. The modern creed in Australia is do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anyone else. It's the opposite of what the ancients said. It's not doing whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anyone else. I was walking down the street with my wife. I saw a young woman coming toward me. You know how T-shirts are like billboards these days, announcing slogans, and hers said, me. Impossible to find. Me. Hard to find. Impossible to forget. And I thought, that's a pretty strong sense of self-esteem to be announcing publicly. Okay, good on her. Kept walking, and there was another young woman, and her T-shirt said, Kate is my religion. And I stopped and said, excuse me, is your name Kate? She said, yes. I said, Kate, are you your own religion? She said, yes, I worship and adore myself. I said, well, all the best with your religion, Kate, and kept going. This notion that I'm the centre, it's all about me, I can do whatever I like without hurting anyone else, actually is hollow. It doesn't lead to deep meaning and purpose. The ancients got it right. It's about virtue to lead to happiness. We lose ourselves when we think it's all about us, and happiness is all about us. The richer I'll be, the happier I'll be. It's deceptive. My work with World Vision puts me in contact with people and places where you'd expect happiness and hope to be in short supply. Let me tell you the greatest discovery I've made in World Vision. I'm in places where I'll never romanticise poverty. It's awful. But where, in poor places, I discover joy and hope, connection to land, dance, celebration, respect for others and elders, cultural experience in poverty. And I come back to Australia where we've solved the problem of supply, how many mobile phones a 16-year-old needs, and how many widescreen digital TVs a family home needs, and there's epidemics of depression and some of the highest youth suicide rates in the world. And I go, something's gone wrong. Virtue, connection, relationship is actually what happiness is about, and living out that virtue. All the best in your course, and thank you for having me here.
Hard to follow that, Tim. I was thinking of architects as thunderbirds, but I don't even think we can call ourselves that. So look, I'm sure that there are some burning questions. So can I get you to maybe stand up and say your name and speak loudly? Andrew.
You said my name.
Right.
I'd just like to hear perhaps maybe some of the lessons learned from the response in RMIT and what you think the World Vision could have done better, and also how do you prepare your workforce going into RMIT for not only the response to the tsunami but also the 30-year civil war conflict?
So RMIT was very different to Sri Lanka and other places where we've always had a footprint. RMIT was closed. RMIT was undergoing a war, and it still is, I think, one of the few places in Indonesia where Sharia law with the full flogging is actually practiced. So we, in going into RMIT, had to start from scratch. That's unusual. We're in nearly 100 countries, and usually you have a footprint, you know, and you're trusted, and so you've opened the door. So RMIT was difficult first for that reason. Secondly, RMIT was difficult for the politics. The Indonesian government, because of that war going on with GAM and the independence fighters and the others, did not want aid agencies there. And it took longer to get in. I thought when the tsunami broke, Sri Lanka and bits of India and elsewhere, Maldives were the focal point. In fact, it was Banda Aceh, but the world didn't know that for a week because they wouldn't let any information out. And they didn't want anyone in there. And they felt, you know, this would run out of control. So politically negotiating, even though we've got a big footprint in lots of the islands of the Indonesian archipelago, to get in there was tricky. Thirdly, it was tricky to know whether there was going to be a cessation of hostilities. Your first duty is always to your own staff, and if you're sending them into where people are firing guns still, it's very difficult to do relief and development. So RMIT had all those difficulties. The learnings, you know, the funny thing is we do learnings after every humanitarian disaster and think we learn, and discover basically none of them ever apply in the next disaster. Every disaster is so unique in different ways, which isn't to say you shouldn't do the learnings, but the learnings from RMIT were we should have probably been even stronger in resisting donor pressure to build permanent houses longer. But that pressure is extraordinary. And you're working against the clock, because the way it goes is disaster, humanitarian outpouring of generosity, lose interest in the story. Next bit of the story is some general has taken aid funds to build a mansion, and the public go, oh, never again, I'm never going to. So you're living with this sort of known timeline of how it works. By the way, the mansions happen in Australia too. We just think they're all corrupt. Well, have a look at the 800 Australians whose names we still don't know invested in Mossack Fonseca in the British Virgin Islands who haven't been paying any tax. But just ask Donald Trump to release his tax returns too while we're at it. It's not just third world where there is this sort of corruption going on. But we were probably, we resisted and did pretty well resisting that donor pressure, but we probably still acted a bit too quickly in doing the rebuilding. We did a full accountability thing. One of the good things about World Vision, why we keep winning transparency awards, is we publish on our website every year our learning and effectiveness review, which actually talks about where we failed, where we stuffed up. And there were failures in Archer, you can go and read them. You know, our marketers hate that. They say, no, tell everyone that every dollar made a difference. Well, no, you failed. You're working in fragile conflict zones. You did your planning and you still got it wrong. So we published that. So they were some of the learnings from Archer. Archer then became the paradigm for why Myanmar, after Cyclone Nargis hit 160,000 died, wouldn't open up. I was one of the very few expats to get in to Burma, Myanmar. Long story that one, pretty curious story, but I got in. I watched military generals with the TV cameras running, ostentatiously handing over to victims of Cyclone Nargis aid, and then when the camera stopped, taking the aid back from them. And people dying of cholera, and I just went public. I did CNN and BBC because I was the only expat voice in there for a while. And the reason why Myanmar wouldn't open up was they said, look what happened in Aceh. As soon as you let NGOs in, this was Myanmar 2008 after the cyclone and while the military was still in power. Look what happens. You open up to NGOs and you lose control. So a lot of the place where we work, the biggest issue is how you balance impartiality. Regimes hate the fact that you help desperate people who might be oppositional to the regime. That's always the biggest problem. And how you walk the line of impartiality with advocacy. Saying, but this is wrong, as I did with the government of Myanmar. You know, we've got a 6-inch pipeline, I kept saying, of aid coming in when we need a 50-metre pipeline because people are dying, thinking I'm going to be kicked out. The journos who came and interviewed me in Myanmar would come with caps, glasses, false moustaches, beards, because they knew as soon as their story and me criticising the Burmese government went to air, they'd be tracked down and thrown out, and they were. I kept waiting to be thrown out, and I wasn't. I was there 2 weeks. But it's that difficulty of advocacy versus impartiality. And you never resolve that in humanitarian work. And even when you've learnt your lessons and say next time, it's always a different situation. It's always fluid.
Imagine it's slightly more difficult task to do that. I'm just interested to know how well you as the organisation.
So we write reports. The figure I quoted for every dollar in mitigation and preparedness, $7 saved when the disaster comes. But you know, humans are sort of not wired to do the sensible things. we're wired to be responsive. You know, I'm often amazed. You know, take the tsunami. We raised $105 million with 2% costs in marketing and overheads. It's normally 20% for us, because Australians died in the tsunami. And when you see suffering with an Australian accent and family members here, you just give. 6 months later, 90,000 died in an earthquake in Pakistan up in the northwest. A massive earthquake, and we responded. It's where Osama bin Laden was recruiting up there. We couldn't raise $1 because no Australians died. And you know the figure, one Australian death's worth 5,000, you know, Pakistani deaths or whatever it might be, Sudanese deaths. We're wired in a way that responds to our own kind, that responds to natural disasters. We are wired not to give to man-made disasters. It's virtually impossible to raise money for innocent suffering of children in Syria or in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, or displaced in Syria, because we go, they're all crazy in the Middle East, and it's a war, and they should just stop fighting, and it's their fault. And they don't seem to like us very much here either. Well, actually, there's 300,000 dead. There's terrible suffering of children. We had this little moment where I and Kurdies watched up on a beach, floating face down, Turkish beach, dressed like one of our kids, floating alone, and this indifference bursts for a moment. We go, that could be our kid. He looks like one of ours. And even the way the Turkish policeman carried him, his limp little body, I think it triggered the pieta in our consciousness, you know, the crucified Jesus and his mother holding his body. So there was this sense of, wow, and giving went up temporarily, then it stopped again. So disaster mitigation is up against that wiring. It's like, oh, well, why would you be investing now? It's not a disaster. You've just got to keep at it, keep trying, keep pushing through. I don't have any other answer.
Just one more question before we...
Yep. You spoke about conflict areas and perhaps sometimes hard infrastructure and development responses are not appropriate. Do you perhaps have an example of how built environment might contribute to software change, as you put it?
I think built environment, that's a very good point, is quite important in terms of helping relationship, community, you know, software change. So in the floods that hit Pakistan, 20 million people displaced. We set up women's only spaces. The men hated this. What are those women talking about? We realised that we could not change the fact that it was girls' job to collect the water, and because often the wells were a long way away from the schools, they'd miss out on school. So built environment, we put the wells and the taps in the reconstruction next to the schools.
Yep.
So they could get the water and come back from school and be in school. A built environment that you're much better to challenge the overall attitude of patriarchy about girls, but there was a hard solution as a way to think out how do you start getting girls back into school. So look, I think creative thinking around this is really important, and the interface between built and that behavioural cultural is incredibly important.
I think we might just wrap up there. I know for the mod students, it's the third day in a row being in Marysville. They're all looking a bit tired, and so are we. And it's interesting having been in a local disaster zone for the last 2 years and seeing what you've been talking about, Tim, in terms of the cycle of disaster, just going round and round. What do we learn? So I'd like to thank our inaugural MoDDD. We'll call you a honorary MoDDD. Tim, you're an extraordinary influence, I think, on all of us, and a really sobering force on Australian society. and so much of what you've talked about tonight, just as humans, let alone as people who want to work in the disaster sector, I think was quite poignant. So thank you, Tim. We're entirely grateful for you coming today, and we're really lucky there wasn't a Category 3 cyclone taking you somewhere else. Just a marketing thing. For anyone interested in the mod degree, you can go to the RMIT website. The degree is located in the School of Architecture and Design, if anyone's interested in that. So thank you.